Hi everyone, welcome back to Flight School. Your connecting flight is about to depart and we're heading over to Germany for part 2 of the darker styles of German beer. I'm Lily Margolis.
And I'm Josh Gosnell.
If you haven't seen part 1, check out the episode from last week.
Right. And moving on to the Augustiner Brau Maximator, which is their Doppelbock. Now, Doppelbock has a little bit of history as well, across Germany, not necessarily just from Augustiner, but starting with the city of Einbeck. So Einbeck, they shortened it to like Becker and out to Bock. So any Bock beer was made in a similar style to those being in Einbecker. This Doppelbock historically was brewed as kind of a monk's beer. The monks would go for their 40-day fast of Lent, to where a lot of them would give up eating meat. They would subsist on basically bread, herbs, oil, and at the time, beer. Sounds a little counterintuitive for us that we just have,
Especially for Lent.
that we have a bunch of drunk monks all over the place. Wasn't quite the same kind of beer. Wasn't quite the same heft of beer. They're brewed at a much lower ABV and is used more as sustenance. They made it as kind of a hearty, hefty, mealtime sort of beer. And then, yes, you'll see with a lot of these Doppelbocks, starting with Polliner, the Polliner brewery in particular, they had their Salvator, essentially a breakdown of the beer for their patron saint. They shortened that up over time to Salvator, where you'll now see a lot of Doppelbocks made either in Germany or here in the US sometimes with that ATOR suffix on the end of it. Just sort of pattern of practice, not a hard fast rule with that, but you'll just see that between Salvator, the Maximator, the Devastator. Even though it says Devastator, it's the ATOR on the end of it. Just kind of a little fun nomenclature thing that they do. Now with Augustiner, these guys have been brewing since about the 1400s. They've had a long history of brewing. This is one of their kind of newer beers, I would say, in the grand scheme of things, to their portfolio. But this one, what do you feel on the nose here? What do you get from it?
This one I get more honey and almost red fruit notes.
Some like currant notes there.
Yeah.
Now I also get just the heat of the alcohol on it. This one being slightly elevated over the 4 and 5 and 6% we've been doing. This one in like the 7, 8, 9 range. This beer has a not unsubstantial amount of alcohol to it. And then even with this beer being bottom fermented, being technically a lager, it has some weight to it.
Mm-hmm.
So with like the Kostritzer, with the Tucher, we have that kind of crisp cleanliness to it. This has it in its own way, but you can definitely feel that heft, that kind of
And
weight.
how does bottom fermentation typically impact the flavor of a beer?
Usually makes it a lot cleaner. So when we have top fermenting ales, they ferment a little bit warmer, they're a little bit more active. They produce more phenols, more esters, more compounds that give us flavors or off flavors in some chances. With lager beers, especially in the German style, they're fermented low and slow. So they were fermented in caves, in basements, underground, using ice. They would ferment very cold for much longer periods of time. That the lager yeast, it's taking its time slowly. The ale yeast, very voracious, rapid consumer of those sugars, and it'll burn very hot and fizzle out quickly. The lager beer kind of takes its time, goes through little by little, a longer drawn out process, but it leaves a cleaner, crisper, lighter feeling beer. in the end.
How do we know that these have been brewed at this one monastery for so long? Do we have some sort of archaeology of alcohol going on here?
There is some historical evidence to this, whether it's government documents, whether it's a lot of these churches making records of that. When the monastery, when the church was built, erected, they almost always had a brewery beside it, for the monks themselves. Some would get in trouble for selling beer to the public or giving it away to the public when they're supposed to be making it just for the monks themselves. That was kind of part of their stipulation. But with that, there is a lot of archaeological evidence to show that beer has been made for thousands of years. There's even a theory out there saying that because we wanted to make beer, that's when we settled out of the nomadic lifestyle to farming. That farming, gathering the wheat in one place, having a farm for that, for the barley, for the wheat, to be able to settle down and make our beer in peace without running across the countryside, could have been something that gave us an initial motivation to start civilization in this way. Even in Germany, for Kostritzer, for example, there was a Celtic king who was found buried with all of his belongings, all of his valuables, wealth, what have you. And among that was a clay jar that had, at one point, not when they excavated it, but at one point had a liquid in it that they determined to be a black sort of beer. Something that had a darker color along the lines of like a Kostritzer, in a very, very, very primitive sort of way, though. I just love this beer. Last but certainly not least, we're going to be looking at the Schneiderweiss Aventinus Eisbock. So, Eisbock, what does that kind of conjure in your mind?
An icebox?
Yes. So, part of where this came from, at least the tale that goes around, is in the brewery Kulmbacher. Essentially, the boss tells one of the workers in the middle of winter, he's like, hey, you need to bring this barrel of beer back into the brewery. It's the middle of winter, it's gonna get cold. The worker had a long day. The boss was already gone, as per usual. Give the employee an order, boss takes off. He's done for the day. The worker looks at it, it's like, it's a massive barrel of beer, 200 pounds. I don't want to roll this thing all the way up the steps, get it back inside. If I leave it here, it's not going to hurt the beer. It'll be fine overnight. It'll survive. Goes home, come back the next day. The owner, the boss, was there, and the entire top portion of the beer had frozen. He was mad about this. He just lost a whole barrel of beer. He's like, what are we going to do? Like, we have to reuse this barrel. You have to clean the beer out of it. So he gets an ice pick, starts chipping away. He eventually hits liquid. He hits this remaining beer. And what it has essentially happened was a freeze distillation. So all of the water in the beer had froze, or a good portion of the water in the beer had frozen, leaving like a lot of that alcohol, a lot of the flavor. It just basically concentrated everything into a stronger, just concentrated Doppelbock. And so that's what Schneiderweiss here is essentially trying to recreate through a little more modernized process than leaving it out in the yard over the winter time. So with this, yes, they do take some of that, freeze little by little, remove some of that water as ice to leave this concentrate here.
Does that concentration raise the ABV of this beer?
Yes, because alcohol by volume, if you're removing a lot of that water out, the volume that's left is not mostly alcohol, but a higher concentration of alcohol for sure. This one being 9.5%. Yeah.
No.
So significant difference between just the regular Doppelbock at 7.5 and the Eisbock at 12%.
Yeah, that's a big difference.
So there is quite a leap in alcohol content to this.
And I'm noticing as well, it does seem a little thicker. It does seem a little viscous if you're just looking at it on the edge of your glass. Like, you can tell that some of the liquid, some of the water has been removed from this.
For sure, it definitely has that viscosity, like you said. Not quite syrupy, but it has a little bit more heft to it. And you had mentioned Bananas Foster before. It's exactly
It's Bananas Foster.
Yeah. You get that caramely, boozy, banana-like little burnt quality to it.
It tastes like Bananas Foster too.
Yeah.
It's dessert.
Yeah, just this rich, like caramely sweet, just glorious banana, and it's not too overcarbonated either, so you let that richness just really stick to your palate for a minute. It lingers with you.
Yeah. And, moving from our first to last beer, I thought it was gonna get, like, darker and heavier, but it seemed like we almost got sweeter. Is that intentional?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, with that, some of these heavier beers, those yeast get tired of eating. After a while, the yeast tires out. They've had their fill. So what they will do is a process called krausening. So what that means is they have their beer, the yeast is full and tired, it's been working out, eating all these sugars, converting it into alcohol and CO2. They'll do is they'll take a fresh beer, one that's actively fermenting. These yeast are rocking, ready to go, they're reproducing, they're multiplying, they're raring to go. They've got everything they need in this beer. They're just super fresh. They're ready to go. Well rested, well fed. Let's do this thing. So they'll take that fresh beer, add a little bit of that to this beer that has slowed its fermentation or stopped its fermentation, and it'll reinvigorate that beer. So what that does is they give this yeast a chance, this fresh new yeast, they give it a chance to go after all of those unconsumed, unfermented sugars in the beer, clean it up a bit, boost the alcohol in some of these aspects, but essentially just give that beer a boost of life to finish out that fermentation process, to get out as much of the sugar that they can. However, in some of these heavier beers, the yeast just can't stand the alcohol content in the beer, so there is a bit of a threshold to it. That's why where in this aspect, the ice distillation, the freeze distillation, removes some of that water, leaving it a more concentrated, more alcoholic beverage, but it still has that sweetness. There isn't that water to kind of cut through that as much. So it also concentrates that sweetness as well.
And I know in the wine world right now, like, vegan wine and organic wine are becoming more popular, especially here in Boulder. Is it possible to have a beer made without yeast, like considered like a vegan beer?
I think yeast being technically a fungus is more or less vegan.
Okay.
So some of the few exceptions to that, yeah, if you're adding bacon to your beer, probably not vegan. If you're adding milk sugar, not vegan. Another clarifying agent that was used in the past was called isinglass, which is powderized fish bladder, if you can believe it. They'd use that to clarify as a fining agent in the beer. One of the biggest companies to do it, who no longer does so, was Guinness. Guinness, I think maybe 15, 20 years ago, was not technically vegan. Now that they've changed that over, they've changed the processes of their filtration or whatnot, they've essentially stopped using isinglass to make it vegan, to appeal to all drinkers. Thank you for joining us on our quick trip to explore the darker styles of Germany.
Thanks for joining us at Flight School today. Subscribe to us on YouTube and leave your questions in the comments.